Welcome to this People and Purpose video. It is my absolute pleasure today to introduce Kim Cameron, who's the William Russell Carey Professor of Management and Organizations at the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan. And he's also the author of Positive Leadership and Practicing Positive Leadership, as well as a number of books on positive organizational scholarship. Welcome, Professor Cameron.
Thank you, Esther, very much.
So before we get into some of the specifics of your research and what you've been finding out about organizations and how organizations can be both more productive but also more positive places to work, you are one of the founding parents, if I may say, of the field of study called positive organizational scholarship. So can I ask you to tell us a little bit about how that came about and what we need to know, or what practicing managers and leaders should know about positive organizational scholarship?
Thank you, Esther. I'm delighted to talk about this. There are different stories, I think, or different scenarios about how this entire field or focus of research came to be. My own personal story is a story that emerged maybe 20 years ago or so when I was studying organizations that were downsizing, that is, consolidating, retrenching, laying people off. And what I noticed in that research over a period of quite a few years is that when organizations downsize, they tend to deteriorate in performance. That is, it's almost universal that performance will go down, productivity goes down, morale goes down, innovation goes down, and so on. Well, I noticed, however, that there are maybe 10 or 15% of organizations that improve or that flourish after downsizing. And the question over time became, how do you explain those very few organizations that get a lot better versus those that do not? Well, excuse me, I ended up not really having data, but began forming an impression over a number of years that the difference was something I referred to as virtuous behavior in the organizations that flourish. That is, forgiveness and integrity and compassion and benevolence and optimism and hope and gratitude and the kinds of things that we aspire our children to develop. But virtuousness isn't really a very acceptable word in rigorous academic circles. So I didn't really do very much about that, but ended up having conversations with my friend Jane Dutton, who had recently formed what they called a compassion lab. They were studying compassion in organizations. That emerged because Jane had had one of her children abused by a babysitter. And Jane has a joint appointment, not only in the business school where I reside and she resides, but also had a joint appointment in psychology. And whereas her psychology colleagues were wonderful human beings, the institutional response to that trauma in Jane's life was, well, look, bad things happen, get over it. The business school, on the other hand, tended to be collaborative and cohesive and supportive and caring and compassionate. And so Jane began developing the idea in mind that this was an institutional or an organization phenomenon, not just an individual phenomenon. And then my friend Bob Quinn, who's been doing work on deep personal change for a long time, we began holding conversations saying, you know what, there's something fundamental at the very core of what we're interested in that's similar. It took us 6 months to come up with a name for it, and the word positive is controversial, but we kind of understood what that meant. Organizational meant that we were focusing on organizations, not attitudes or not the psyche, but we were focusing on the organization phenomena themselves, because again, individuals may behave differently or may be positive or optimistic. That does not mean that the organization will be so. It's much more complex at the organization level. And then scholarship meant we didn't want to just be one more set of self-help manuals or, consultant tools. Rather, we needed to make certain that there was a rigorous, empirical, and theoretically grounded approach. Otherwise, it becomes a fad. It's just one more thing. So we wanted to create a scholarly foundation that we could build on and that would expand and that would also become much more broad than just the University of Michigan or just our own research agendas. So that field kind of caught on because I think at our very core, people kind of believe if the world was more virtuous, there would be no poverty, there would be no war, everyone would be well educated, it would be the best of the human condition. And so we're essentially studying not only how do you overcome problems and challenges, but how do you unleash the potential in human beings to become the best they can imagine? That is, we sometimes refer to that as even positive deviance or flourishing or thriving. So we're studying how you find the attributes of a flourishing, thriving organization. And how do you get, if you could identify it, then how do you predict it? How do you foster it? How do you enable it? So that is a long answer, Esther, but that's essentially how positive organizational scholarship emerged.
And it's certainly a field of study that has, I think, appealed not only to academics but also practitioners and managers and leaders. This notion that it is possible, especially in difficult times, but not only in difficult times, to build organizations which respond positively, that grow, that flourish, and have that, for lack of a better word, positive response. So, what are you finding from your research as some of the key attributes of organizations that are capable of thriving and flourishing?
That's a wonderful question, as you might expect, with a very complex, long answer. We've discovered a variety of factors that make a big difference. One of them, which happens to be a focus of some of my research, has to do literally with virtuous practices. We've discovered that when organizations develop or implement institutionalize virtuousness, it has a major impact on profitability. For example, when organizations literally are more compassionate, more supportive, kinder to employees, forgive mistakes as opposed to hold grudges or punish people, and so on. There's a set of those factors. When those are in place, even in organizations like, for example, Wall Street firms, not to mention education or healthcare or manufacturing or retail organizations, when those are in place, regardless of the industry, profitability goes up significantly, productivity goes up, quality is better, fewer mistakes, fewer errors, more innovation, customer satisfaction, customer retention, customer um, engagement is higher, and employee retention, employee engagement, employee satisfaction is higher. Those 6 factors. So, virtuousness by definition does not need a payoff. For example, if I am kind to you, Esther, only to get what I want, or in other words, I will only be kind if I can get an expected return. Well, by definition, it ceases to be kindness. It's now
Right.
manipulation. So I don't need a payback, but as it turns out, I get one if I implement virtuous practices in organizations. And that's important because, of course, leaders, managers are held accountable for productivity and profitability and stock price and so on. So that's one finding. Another finding is, not surprisingly, relationships matter. So my friend Jane has done a lot of work on what's referred to as high quality connections. Now, that's different than a relationship, which lasts for a while, but a high quality connection can be the temporary interaction with a person behind a counter, or the mailman who comes by, or woman, or that is just the connections of temporary interpersonal relations makes a big difference in organizations. When you can foster or enable high quality connections, once again, not only are employees benefited, but those with whom they serve, like customers and suppliers and people outside the organization, are benefited and performance goes up. There's still another one has to do with what we're doing a little research on now called positive energy. Now, what's positive energy? So when I interact with Esther, what happens to my energy? Am I uplifted, elevated? Is she life giving? Or is she exhausting, depleting, and just sucks the energy right out of me, in which case she would be a de energizer. Now, there are several important things about energy that we've discovered, and it's crucial, as it turns out, for um, predicting performance in organizations. So, for example, we've discovered that positive energizers are higher performers themselves in an organization. And the way we measure energy is literally by other people simply saying, when I interact with Esther, what happens to my energy? See, they don't rate Esther, they rate how they're responding when they interact with Esther. So if she's life giving, I give her a 7. If she's life depleting, I give her a 1. So on a Likert scale. All right. If Esther is evaluated by others, that is, they tend to be uplifted and energized, as it turns out, she is a higher performer. You'd expect that.
Right.
But here's the surprise in the research. Your position, that is the extent to which you're a positive energizer, is 4 times more important than the extent to which you're an influencer, or in other words, you have title and position, and 4 times more important than the extent to which you're at the center or hub of an information network. That is, you know all the information, you have access to the organization's secrets, you can decide what to share. In other words, energy is 4 times more important than influence and 4 times more important than information. Now, here's why that's important. We spend a lot of time, leaders spend a lot of time managing information. Did you come to the meeting? Did you get the memo? Do you understand the goals? And so on. And we spend a lot of time on influence. Here are the goals. Here's the incentive system. We need to motivate you to get the job done and so on. Turns out energy is 4 times more important than those two. So leadership is generally equated with influence in the literature. I don't know, 80 or 90% of all the literature on leadership says leaders are influencers. That's fine, except that energy is 4 times more important in predicting performance of the individuals and of the organization. So that's one finding that's kind of interesting. Another is the highest performing organizations have at least 3 times more positive energizers in the organization than normal organizations. In other words, positive energy is a non-zero sum game. In other words, everybody can be a positive energizer in an organization. Everybody can't be influential. That's kind of based on power, and power will always be constricted. I mean, if I'm powerful and somebody else is powerful and we conflict, that generally leads to conflict. I mean, of the 37 wars on the planet, almost all of them are essentially asking the question, well, who's going to really be in charge? Power will lead to conflict. Energy, on the other hand, because everyone can be energizing, generally leads to collaboration. Because, for example, if Esther is positively energizer, I'm positively energizing, I'm attracted to her. That is, positive energy is an attractor. We call it the heliotropic effect.
Right.
All living systems have a tendency to flourish or to be attracted toward positive energy and languish or avoid negative energy. And there's lots of research to suggest that's the case. But anyway, that's just another factor that we've uncovered as part of this positive organization scholarship field that helps predict performance that normally we haven't even been aware of before.
And that's absolutely fascinating. It's a really interesting field of study, no doubt, and just showing that our traditional measures for impact may not be sufficient and certainly not exhaustive. If a leader wanted to develop in themselves and in others this positive energy, are there any specific behaviors that that correlate, or are there any particular practices that you would suggest to leaders they build into their leadership practice in order to become more, to exude more positive energy and to build more positive energy in others?
Well, it's not rocket science. It's not very sophisticated. It's something we mostly know about already. So, small things. For example, um, people who are positively energizing help other people flourish.
Mm.
That is, it's the opposite of being selfish, self aggrandizing, making sure I get the reward. It's helping other people flourish as well. That tends to be energizing. It's kind of like what mothers do with kids. Mothers are positively energizing because generally their role is helping their children flourish, develop capability. That's part of what positively energizing people do as well. Another, excuse me, another is that they tend to be heedful, pay attention, give people their focus as opposed to being distracted. That's not very surprising, but it's amazing how few interactions occur when you have the entire attention and the entire focus of the individual. Another is positive energizers tend to be problem solvers rather than problem creators.
Right.
I have some phone calls that I receive when I look at caller ID and I think to myself, oh goodness, here comes another problem. Because there are some folks who constantly are problem creators. That is, they're always raising issues, problems, obstacles. There are some, on the other hand, who are incredibly problem solving people in my life. One of them is my assistant, Meredith, who, for example, it will not be unusual for me to make a plane reservation. Next week, I go to Japan, and she'll say, oh, I noticed you're going to Japan, but I don't know how you're going to get from the airport to the hotel, so I've arranged transportation. Or I noticed that you've got to have some handouts. I know that it may be difficult to copy them in Japan, so here they are. I've packaged them up. You can take them with her. I mean, she's constantly a step ahead of me, solving a problem I didn't know was a problem yet. And she is incredibly energizing, just gives life to me. Anyway, I have a list of about a dozen of those, but they're not, again, not very surprising.
Right.
They're things that we all kind of know exist, but what positive organizational scholarship has done is to raise them to the surface. So we began now creating an empirical foundation, that is, empirical evidence, that when applied, they actually work. It actually improves performance.
And that empirical evidence is actually so important, isn't it? Because some of these positive approaches are often thought of as nice to haves, as leaders who happen to be that way inclined might do them, but actually either being seen as detracting of organizational focus on performance or not making very much of a difference. So it's fascinating to see the empirical research coming through that suggests that actually these positive practices and virtuous practices and just the practices which are all around allowing others to flourish, in fact, have a positive impact on the bottom line, and it's not an either or.
It's really true that, I mean, there are lots of small experiments that have been done. One of them you're aware of, Esther, and it is, for example, having people keep what we refer to as gratitude
Right.
journal. I know companies literally with 100,000 employees where the CEO has handed out to every single employee a journal, and they say part of our performance management system will be to have you keep a journal. You have to keep a journal. We want you to write in it every day. Take 5 minutes before you go to bed and write in your journal. But what we want you to do is write down 3 things for which you're grateful, or the 3 best things that happened to you today. As opposed to, for example, experiments that have been done is simply taking half the people and ask them to keep a gratitude journal, half to keep a normal journal. And at the end, literally, of just a few weeks, there have been a number of tests done. And I'll give you some examples of the tests just to highlight the impact of just a very small intervention like a gratitude journal. So, for example, if everyone in the if half are keeping gratitude journals, half are not, and at the end of a period of time, 3 or 4 weeks is all it takes. But at the end of that time, everyone is given a flu shot, and then after 1 week, people are given the opportunity to test for the number of antibodies in their system. As it turns out, those keeping a gratitude journal are healthier. They have more antibodies in their system at the end of 1 week than do those who are just keeping a normal journal. Or, for example, those that are keeping a gratitude journal, when given what's called a mental acuity test or task. That means you have to memorize information, you have to remember information, you have to come up with sophisticated decision rules with some complex data. Those keeping a gratitude journal actually have higher levels of cognitive functioning. Their brain works differently, and there are MRI scans to show more areas of your brain are activated after keeping a gratitude journal. And there's less depression after a traumatic event in life. There's higher levels of creativity, that is, more ideas and a broader variety of ideas. It's called mental flexibility among those keeping a gratitude journal. So many experiments, small experiments, just on small interventions like that. Another intervention, I'll give you one other quick one. There was a study done here on our campus by a psychologist. She took entering freshmen, these are 18 and 19-year-old students coming into the University of Michigan. She asked them to identify their goals for the year. Now, some of these students had goals that they referred to as achievement goals. I want good grades. I want a girlfriend. I want to be popular. I want to make the team, or whatever. Another set of students were dominated by what she referred to as contribution goals. I want to contribute. I want to make something better. I want to have something improve as a result of my efforts. Now, everyone has both kinds of goals, but some were dominated by one type, achievement goals. Some were dominated by the other type, contribution goals. Then the experiment was she simply followed these students for 1 year, one academic year, measuring how well they got along with roommates, what their grade point average was at the end of both semesters, how many minor physiological symptoms, that is, physical kinds of effects, how many times they missed class, how many times they made the club or made some kind of achievement. On every single dimension, contribution goals trumped achievement goals. That is, it's what you contribute more than what you get. Now, almost always in organizations, reward systems, incentive systems, are based on giving people stuff. But as it turns out, much higher performance can be predicted if not only do you give people stuff, but you give them an opportunity to contribute to somebody or something else. So contribution, as it turns out, is even more important than reward. There's one other quick study. It's done with multiple sclerosis patients, MS patients. This was an experiment done in a healthcare setting. Half of the MS patients were required or received once a week, they received a phone call from someone expressing support, love, concern, and so on. The other half of these patients were required to place a phone call to someone else expressing love, concern, support, and care. Then, after a 2-year period of time, they simply measured a variety of factors, including physical activity and recovery and depression and so on. There was an 8-fold difference.
Wow.
Those who placed the calls were 8 times better than those who received the calls. That is, contributing, giving, making a difference in somebody else's life is not only energizing for me, but as it turns out, many factors are not only energizing for the person receiving the call, but there are many factors that occur in me that help lift me 8 times better. The whole point of that is there's a whole bunch of small little interventions. We probably have 25 different interventions that will help an organization get better and an individual get better. But again, all of them are empirically based. There's evidence that it actually works, which is much better than the normal airport bookstore advice that we sometimes rely on.
Fair enough. I was actually going to ask you about what you see as the mechanism between these approaches or behaviors and improved business performance. And you've already touched on some of the almost physical ones, actually, the physiological, and
Yes.
some of the cognitive gains just from a practice like writing in a gratitude journal. Are there any other mechanisms that you would want to highlight that will help leaders understand how building more virtuous organizations will actually lead to business results?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Esther. And as you might expect, not yet fully answerable or answered, because there are
Mm.
probably many mechanisms we have not yet studied or uncovered. But one of there are several theories that explain why these things work in an organization. One of them is this thing called the heliotropic effect. That is, all living systems are inherently attracted to positive and avoid or are diminished in the presence of the negative. So, for example, think of in nature, the sun is the source of positive energy. It's the life-giving force. All living systems are attracted to light and away from dark. There's a lot of experiments, even down at the bottom of the ocean where there's no light. You go down and put a strobe light, turn it on, and they discovered 100 new species because everything is attracted to light, even those that have developed over many, many, many centuries without even eyes. But anyway, there's a lot of research confirming something called the heliotropic effect. So one theory is that inherent in the human condition is a tendency to do better when there's positive practices and positive climate. That's one. Another, excuse me, is something, it's actually a psychological colleague or psychologist colleague that I have, a good friend, used to be here at Michigan, is now at North Carolina, who has developed something called a broaden and build theory.
Right.
Barbara Fredrickson, who on the psychological level, when you expose people to positive factors, virtuousness, positive emotions, and so on, you tend to broaden their perspective. People can actually take in more information, broadening. And building means people tend to repeat or don't know what the other word is other than repeat, to repeat what they've just seen. If you see something inspiring, or for example, if you see someone express gratitude to someone as a result of a favor, the tendency in all human beings is to repeat or build on that event.
Mm-hmm.
So you tend to give something to someone else or express gratitude to somebody else. All right, now you put that in an organization setting. When practices begin reinforcing virtuousness, expressing compassion and care and concern for others, what that does is multiply itself. It broadens and it builds. So people tend not only to see this in one another, but they tend then to interact that way with customers and suppliers. And relationships between superiors and subordinates are much less tense. And instead of engineering and marketing fighting about what the product, they tend to coordinate a little better. That is, the informal communication systems, for example, tend to get more smooth. So just a lot of the obstacles, a lot of the abrasions and difficulties that sometimes occur in organizations tend to be smoothed out. So that's just that notion of, we sometimes refer to it as a building or a reinforcing of these factors.
Mm.
And another one is this finding or this mechanism has emerged out of our work on downsizing. As it turns out, these factors tend to buffer the organization. That is, it's not only amplifying, that's the word I was trying to think of. Broaden and build also means amplifying. It tends to positive practices tend to amplify themselves. They also buffer the organization against trauma. We've done a lot of studies on organizations facing downsizing and trauma and uncertainty and complexity in their environment and so on. When they implement a variety of these positive practices, especially positive leadership and so on, institutionalizing virtuousness, the negative factors that almost always occur in downsizing, tend to be diminished. They tend not to occur nearly as frequently as when the organization doesn't practice those. So among the mechanisms, they're not all of them, but among the mechanisms are a diminishing of the negative, or the trauma, or the uncertainty, or the the conflicts that occur, the restricted communication channels that occur, what's called threat rigidity responses. When you get threatened, you tend to get rigid. You hunker down, hold on. People tend to be much more open to new information. So the negative gets diminished, and the amplifying effect of the positive tends to elevate. So you get more good stuff, less bad stuff in those organizations. And as you might expect, that turns out to be translated into the bottom line in both profitability, certainly revenues. In non-profit organizations, it literally is revenues go up, and relationships with external constituencies are tighter and better, and so on. So those are just that's pretty academic and pretty probably esoteric, Esther, but that's part of what organization theory does. Is it tries to make simple things complex, and sure enough, I've just done that.
But just as importantly, it tells us what can be seen in the evidence and what the research actually supports, as opposed to what feels like a nice idea or a good plan. But turning this into guidance for leaders, if someone is now listening to this and thinks, actually, I can see the opportunities in my organization to introduce more positivity, to introduce more virtuousness, to have more of a sense of contribution. What would you suggest some of the key first steps might be for a practicing manager or leader? Where do they start?
That's a good question, and I think there are many little tools, and I don't know if there is a sequence or an order, and I don't know if I would prescribe any one thing because organizations face pretty different environments, and it certainly should be customized. At least when I've helped organizations try to implement positive practices or virtuousness or make positive organization scholarship practical, that's not necessarily been the same in each one. So let me just give you 3 or 4 examples that organizations could use to build on. So frequently an assessment is a first step that organizations use. And sometimes it's an assessment of organization culture. Sometimes it's an assessment of the problems and issues that arise. Sometimes it's a 360 assessment to try to figure out where the leaders need to pay attention and so on. So let me give you just one quick example of what we've developed here. When I get an assessment, particularly of myself or of my unit, almost always I look for the low scores. I look for what I'm not doing so well. Even in teaching ratings in class, students may say, good class, good class, good class. And if somebody says bad class, good class, good class, good class, the bad class feedback gets my attention. And it's the same thing with other kinds of feedback. So what we've done is to say, look, rather than driving toward just solving problems, which, by the way, is important, you don't ignore those. But what happens is we focus so much on the problems that we never do focus on the positive or extraordinary parts of the organization that we could help flourish. So we've developed a tool, and we simply refer to it as the best self-feedback process. It goes like this. I ask you, Esther, to identify 20 people who know you well. Colleagues at work, family members, neighbors, friends, people in the community. Maybe a representative of each of those groups. I ask you to identify 20 of them and then ask them to do you a favor. The favor is please write 3 short paragraphs describing me when you saw me add unique value. What kind of strengths did I display? Or in other words, when I did something special and really added unique value, what did I do? Just describe that for me. Now, a variation on that is, when did you see me at my best? Now, trouble with that is you don't necessarily get behavioral activity. So when you made a significant contribution that was unique, what happened? So now, Esther, you're going to get back 60 stories from people who know you well. And they're all positive. This is a very special attribute. These are special behaviors. These are special contributions that Esther has made. I got 60 of those. Then we take you through a process to identify or create a best self portrait. In other words, at my very best, at the unique contribution, at the high edge of my best self, here's the kind of person I am, here's the kind of behaviors I display, here's what people most appreciate about me. It's not unusual for people to say, as a result of those 60 stories, well, this is pretty easy for me, it's kind of natural. That's true, but that doesn't mean we always are aware of them and can capitalize on them. So, one tool is not only feedback about where the issues or problems are, but where are the special strengths? Now, you can do that in the organization as well as with the individuals. Not only a best self portrait for the person, you can develop a best self portrait for the organization. So that's one assessment tool. Not necessarily relevant to everyone, maybe not even important as a first step, but that's a tool. Another tool, we also help people. Well, let me start in a different place. What we know is that organizations and individuals do much, much better if there is a rationale or meaningfulness associated with the tasks or the job. If I'm just doing a job routinely over and over and over again, think of an assembly line, it doesn't really matter if I make a mistake, somebody's going to catch it down the line. I'm not even sure what the final product looks like, and so on. Boy, meaningless job, or flipping hamburgers, I can do this because I need to get paid. That's very different, as it turns out, than a highly meaningful job in which people are saying, I'm making a difference, I'm making a contribution. Something will get much better as a result of what I'm doing, and it matters a lot to me. It has a very value-based association with what I care about.
Right.
Um, if meaningfulness becomes a part of the work, we've seen dramatic improvements in quality and output and productivity and so on. Okay, so here at Michigan, we've developed something referred to as a job crafting exercise. People are, regardless of their task, regardless of the position in the hierarchy, it's possible to craft the job. That's the jargonish acronym, or in other words, redesign the work so that it has very close and very important attachment to something very meaningful. So we have in organizations often recrafted people's jobs to help them understand something really meaningful about what they're doing, whereas it was not transparent in the first place. An easy example of that is one of the research studies we did was interviewing custodians, housekeepers in a hospital.
Mm-hmm.
One of the people who was assigned to the oncology ward, that's the place where people get chemotherapy. They're often the sickest they will ever be in their lives. Her job, and they lose control of their bowels, they're vomiting, it's just a messy place. Her job is to clean all that up. She said in the interview, I believe my job is at least as important as the physician's, maybe more so. Because she said these people are embarrassed. They're the worst. They're feeling the worst they'll ever feel in their lives. I can help lift them. I can tell them it's an honor to help you get better. Don't worry about the mess. I'm happy to clean it up because I know it'll help you heal and become better. She said that is at least as important as the guy who's putting the needle in their arm with the chemicals. All right, now if you can find profound purpose, meaningfulness in cleaning up vomit, you can find it in anything. That is, it's not the task, it's the way we define or interpret the nature of the task. So we simply have a little tool that helps unlock that kind of meaningful. It's just another one, another tool. We have tools that help people identify positive energy networks in their organization. That is, identify those quasars, those people who positively energize other people, who are sort of bright stars. And by the way, that is not related to hierarchical level. Lots of people at the top end of the organization who suck the energy out of the system. Lots of people at the bottom of the organization who give energy to everybody around them. And in one of the interventions in a big or financial services organization, one of the first things we did was to create a positive energy network map. That is, let's identify in this organization all of these quasars. Now, this is a multinational organization. And so the CEO found 26 highly positively energizing people. Most of them were relatively low level. Brought them to the U.S. Some of them had never been to the United States before. Brought them to the U.S. We spent one day with them. And his assignment was, okay, 26 people, your job is to infect the rest of this organization with the new culture and the new set of values in the next 90 days. They said, well, we can't do it in 90 days. People have full agendas. I mean, it's impossible. He said, no, that's your task. I'll leave the room, he said, for 3 hours. You determine what you need and how you're going to get this job done. I stayed with the people in the room. He left. He came back 3 hours later. They said, okay, we need a plane trip to come back here. We need a website that we can communicate with each other. We need a film by you to explain the new vision and so on. And then, by the way, what does infect mean? And he said that means people can teach the new culture, the new values to somebody else, and they will have tried one new initiative to try to foster or enable or move toward the new value.
Right.
Instead of 90 days, in 83 days, 96% of that, I think it was 140,000 people in that organization, had been infected with the new culture. I mean, he just unleashed this positive energy change team, this network of people throughout the entire world organization who are on fire. And bingo, it was probably the fastest culture change initiative I've ever seen. It happened in probably a year and a half or two rather than normally the 5 or 6. These are examples of what people might want to do when they say, I want to try to implement some of these positive practices.
That is brilliant, and thank you so much for your insights. I think there's a lot of both inspiration but also specific guidance for people to take on board. But I really, really enjoyed speaking with you.